In his disputes with the Ahlul-hadith, he finds that they're easy to refute. So, سَقَطُوا فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ عَاجِزِينَ مُتَحَيِّرِينَ. They were, Razi said, they were unable to deal with serious disputation. When somebody came to them with rigorous rules of logic, the Ahl al-Hadith really didn't have much to say and were generally easily defeated in the debate because they just weren't trained in those kind of rigorous, almost mathematical procedures for determining what, in this case, is the correct doctrine or the correct fiqh. This is again an issue that we have in our contemporary context. So many arguments amongst Muslims nowadays are based on semi-competent or incompetent individuals taking what they think to be the meaning of a single hadith and not really using any kind of general awareness of what the hadith taken as a totality might mean, without having any real fiqh or deep knowledge, the wisdom of the religion which will enable them to see how the hadith should be used. Because the jurists, the real fuqaha, do not follow the hadith alone, and this is an important part of the manhaj, the way of the salaf. They do not only follow the hadith. You have to have fiqh as well. So Sufyan ibn Uyayna, who's one of the great imams of the salaf, even says, and it sounds a bit edgy, al-hadithu madillatun illa lil ulama, or illa lil fuqaha in another riwayah. Hadith is a source of misguidance except for the jurists, except for the real scholars. Because any Tom, Dick or Harry can find a book of hadith, maybe find it even in translation, and can say, oh, this is Allah's law. No, you have to have the fiqh, the understanding of how the law is applied, how to use a hadith, how to determine a hadith, what's abrogated, what's not abrogated, correct Arabic. If you don't have those things, then you're going to be a source of misguidance. And this is the way of the salaf. Never interpret a hadith according to its superficial meaning unless you're really a super scholar who knows these intellectual instruments and can avoid making these errors. Ibn Wahab, again a great student of the Malikis, used to say this: but for Malik and Al-Layth, I would have been lost. I used to believe that everything related from the Prophet ﷺ must be put into practice. That was his view. If it's in a hadith, you have to follow it. That was his early understanding. And when he encountered the fuqaha, he would see that no, there is a larger structure of fiqh which is determined by the scholars on the basis of the correct understanding of the hadith. But the hadith is not an alternative to fiqh. Imam Ahmad also used to say, it's quite characteristic of Imam Ahmad's approach, quoting from one great hadith scholar, Yahya al-Qattan, if somebody follows every rukhsa in the hadith, they become fasiq. In other words, you can be a great hadith scholar and you can find that there are hadiths which genuinely authorize some concession, some easy approach. You can follow those hadiths, you're Ahlul-hadith, but you become fasiq. You don't have the fiqh that will enable you to see where it is appropriate to use a rigorous interpretation, where it's appropriate to use the rukhsa or the concession. Imam Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, another great imam of the Salaf, used to say, when I hear a hadith, I look to see what part of it is applicable, I apply that and leave the rest. You must know the context as well. You must know what is relevant in the hadith, and that is a hugely sensitive issue and has to be done by the fuqaha. Nowadays we find people become Muslim and the next day they're holding a majlis in the mosque and they're looking at somebody's translation of Bukhari and giving fatwas, and that's just the destruction of the Sharia. And there is too much of that at the moment. This is what Imam Shafi'i is against. The manhaj of the Salaf never involves taking the literal sense of the hadith. Ibn Hibban, coming later on in the Shafi'i madhab, whoever does not have fiqh is always weak in hadith. He might have memorized 1,000,000 hadith, but if he doesn't have fiqh, he's weak. So that's the problem that the first school, the Ashab al-hadith, have, that they think that the hadith is the fiqh.